speak about causal blankets, and the idea here, like at a very high level, is that we have all the ideas of agency and discovering agents and all that, and we have computational mechanics in the other hand. And I was trying to bring these two together in some way. And this is a very preliminary result work. What we're going to present today is actually a paper that we wrote with some friends, including Daniel and some others. This is a very small paper that was included in proceedings of a conference a few years ago. And this is very much like the first step in a direction that I think is promising, but this is like what we have done, I think, is very little, and there is a lot more to be done. So the idea of this presentation, I don't have so many slides, so I would be very happy to, if we can have discussions and what you think about these ideas and how do you think they could be used or extended or improved. So the starting point was this, old question about what is an agent, what is a self. You have a cup of coffee interacting with the environment because it's dissipating heat, while you have a bee that is actually building a colony, and then we would like to say that maybe one way of thinking is that if the interaction with the environment is one way, so usually we don't think that the cup of tea is affecting the environment when it cools down. So there is sort of a one-way effect from the environment to the cup of tea, but not the other way around. Versus when you have animals behaving in an environment, usually the environment affects the animals, but the animals can also affect the environment. So that's maybe one first very rough idea on how to start thinking. Yes?
Yeah, if you have an hot enough cup of tea, it definitely affects the environment, right? What would you that affect maybe?
In the sense that the temperature of the environment is not going to change significantly because the temperature of the coffee is decreasing. That's what I mean. Of course it does, but you could neglect it, and that's what we usually do in statistical mechanics.
This sounds to me more like the coffee, a hot cup of coffee does not try to maintain its existence. That's what it sounds more like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to do any strong claims here. This is just like sort of very loose ideas to start warming up. Then another question is, when do you have an agent that is doing cognition and is reasoning? And one idea that I really like from this paper is about describing a system either as an agent or as a non-agent. So in the case of an agent, you would try to describe, let's say you just have like behavioral data. You have a time series of what something is doing, and you would try to describe it as following some laws, some equations, or you try to describe it as solving some MDP. And maybe one of the two descriptions is much shorter than the other one, and that could be a reason to assign the label of agent or not an agent. So that's another type of way of thinking about this.
Pat, so what about a random string? Isn't that pretty? Then it would be on the right hand side. If you need.
What about random
It's
string?
not compressible. It's like the point is that you can't express it in a smaller way, so it would be an agent.
I think to this paper, you have to get a significant improvement by calling it an agent. So if it's roughly equal to both, it's also not an agent.
Okay, so that's your condition. Then.
Right, so yeah, I think the condition in the paper is you describe it as an agent, describe it as a non-agent. If you can describe it as an agent in like significantly fewer bits, then it's an agent.
And of course, I don't think this paper has solved the problem, but these are some ideas that I found interesting. Another type of reasoning is if we start from physics and we have a physical system that we're doing physical stuff, when are we inclined to call that physical system an agent? So a river or some whirling in the river, we call it an agent under some conditions. And some people, like Carl Friston, have this idea that whenever you have some blanket, some boundary, then physics looks as agency. So that is one way of thinking about the problem, that agency is very strongly related with these boundaries. The boundaries meaning the way the agent interacts with the environment. And usually this interaction is of two ways. So the agent senses the environment, so there is perception going on, and then the agent is acting on the environment. So there is these two arrows connecting these two systems, and then the attribution of agency would be very strongly related to identifying these boundaries. And according to Carl, he has this condition of Markov blankets, that whenever you find a Markov blanket in nature, then that's sufficient necessary, I guess, to say that physics looks as if cognition and inference and all that. So that's another proposition that is associating very strongly the identification of agency with the identification of boundaries. Now let's talk a little bit about Markov blankets. So I also a little funny story. How did I get into this story? One of my pet projects during the pandemic was to get into the free energy principle. And I don't know how many of you is familiar with the free energy principle. Are you? I would not ask your opinion on the free energy principle.
You should have asked how many of you that do understand the free energy principle.
That's a very continuous.
You might be carrying over.
Understanding is ladder, many ranks are missing.
Yeah. So I tried to start reading the free energy principle, and the first thing I stumbled upon was this idea of Markov blanket. And I started reading papers, and I couldn't find the definition of what exactly does it mean to be a Markov blanket according to this Fristonian view of things. But nevertheless, there are a lot of papers that they claim a lot of things, and they have multi-scale Markov blankets. They apply Markov blankets to the biosphere. There is a whole industry on this. So after banging my head very heavily for this is with the literature of the 2020 and 2021. This is my understanding of what do they mean with Markov blankets. So you have environment variable. You have an internal variable that we can call as M, that's sort of memory. And then there is a sensing process from the environment to the memory, and then there's an action process from the memory to the environment. So you want to build this loop, and you want to build these variables in between that are going to be sufficient statistics. They are going to mediate all the interaction from the inside to the outside and vice versa. So that's the spirit of what they're trying to do. Now, what they put as a condition is...
Did they say why they want to do it?
Not really. Well, yes, no, they do.
It has nice consequences.
Because according to Carl, from this construction you can derive Bayesian inference from physics. That's the claim. And I will get into that. So the definition is, the first thing that you want is that you want for these intermediate variables to be a sufficient statistic that is mediating all the interaction between the internal and the external. And they do this by saying the stationary distribution is going to be factorizable like this. Right? So this is a definition. And the argument is if you know the state of the sensory and the action variables, then the internal state and the external state become conditionally independent. Now, with that, you can see there is no asymmetry. There is no direction in the loop. There is no way to distinguish sensory from action, from this condition, right? These two things are completely symmetric in this equation. So then they had this other idea that in some way this should be caused by this and not by this, and this should be caused by this and not by this. So to impose that asymmetry, so that sensory is caused by the environment and the action is caused from the internal state, but not vice versa, they impose this another condition that is on the other side that has to do with the dynamics of the system. And they decide, okay, we're going to think of Langevin dynamics because why not? And then based on that, you're going to have this F, and the F's are going to depend on some and not the others, and by that, you're going to get the asymmetry that you want. So that
still looks symmetric to me.
So for example, if the evolution of the action depends on the internal state and the state of the action and the state of the sensory, but not the state of the environment. So there are few variables that are not present.
It breaks this the action and sensory symmetry, but not the overall flip symmetry. Like if you flip M and E and
Yes.
you also flip S and A, then
Yes.
you have that symmetry still.
Yes, and they are happy with that. I'm not happy with that, but they are.
But like
Yeah.
you could still reliable sensory as actions and memory as environment.
Yeah, that's what we
this
said.
is symmetrical.
That is something I'm actually partly talking about tomorrow. So the difference between world and agent formally is very small. Where the difference comes in is in information density. So the world is much less informationally dense than the agent. That's where the asymmetry comes from, in my opinion, right? So
I mean, you can imagine a game where the environment is just another agent, and then there would be symmetry.
that I explicitly excluded that. You're completely right. Then everything becomes pantheistic. Everything is kind of an agent. But I specifically looked at the case where we have this naive objective object and not agentic environment, and then it's basically the assumption that the environment is much simpler or much more compressible than the agent. Compressible is not enough. It's more than that. But anyway.
But with this construction, they keep the symmetry between environment and agent, but they break some other, and they're happy with this. Now, one point that my friend Martin found, I think the first, that is not very crazy to find, but anyway, he was the first to point it out, is that these two things are usually not compatible, and it's not that you can derive one from the other or vice versa. And it's very complicated to find the f's that are going to give you a stationary distribution that you can factorize. And they were taken for granted. It's sort of the same thing, so it should work.
How much was Christian bothered by this observation?
We can relate about that. But the point is that I can see what they are trying to build, but I don't find this construction very elegant, to put it like that. And based on this consideration and some others, there has been a literature criticizing this construction. The first one was from Martin, where he was pointing out this and other concerns. The paper of Martin is remarkable. Like, there is a map of the paper of Martin is criticizing specifically this life as we know it. That is a paper where Carl proposed that the Markov blankets are enough to make physics looks as if Bayesian inference. And then Martin took the paper in this critique, and he split the claims into 10 or 12, and then he showed all the errors, and then he tried to fix them, and then he showed they were still unfixable. It's a very long paper, very thorough. He spent a lot of work, and then there is a counter response to the critique that is not great. And you can really don't get your own conclusions, but I didn't.
Are the claims so great? It's worth all this effort to resurrect this stuff? Because I read it early on, and I kind of put it.
I think part of it is.
So Friston responded.
Yeah. But the answer question was not very convincing. And it's true, but on the other hand, this literature has a lot of influence in a specific community of psychiatrists and psychologists. They take it for granted that this math is so complicated, it should be right, and they go with it. Seriously.
I mean, that sounds like the Julian Cohen's framework too. I mean, he's appealing to this psychiatry, psychology literature, and I'm not sure that's
Part
the
of
basis
it,
for doing good physics and mathematics.
part of it is that Friston has a long reputation of being naturally brilliant, like neurobiologist, and like has done a lot of good work in this.
Julian Cohen is also smart.
Right, and so I
like
think-
him, we're friends, but I don't buy it.
Yeah, no, agreed. But I think a lot of it is that they kind of like build this
Friends.
intellectual capital in one field, and then they're like using it to try and peddle their pet theories,
Yeah.
and then that's why it gets respect, and that's why people bother to try and take it down.
I think also that Friston has a lot of intuition, and he knows what he wants. He has an idea what he wants. But the problem is he tries, in my opinion, to pack too many abilities into this one model, and so it becomes essentially vacuous. Not really vacuous, but it's a Bayesian inference.
Yeah, integrated information theory for Tona is the same thing.
Oh.
I respect, this deep disciplinary training in psychiatry. Consciousness is a hard problem, but at some point, there's what you actually emit and share with people through mathematics. It's like, it's a little bit. You need to pay a little more attention to other folks. Sorry,
Totally
I mean,
agree.
it might be a systemic thing though, right? You have to sell this shit. Excuse my language.
Yeah.
And so they go crazy trying to sell it, right?
Yeah.
When they should just be doing the science and the basic math.
Yeah.
But I think it's systemic. It's not just him. It's like the field is actually
True.
producing
That's a fair point.
these
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
So when I got in with this literature, I felt that the math, I couldn't follow it and it made no sense to me, but I like some of the basic intuitions and ideas. And I'm curious if you could impose a condition such that you could recover inference. I mean, I don't know if you can do it. I'm certainly that construction doesn't work, but maybe another could work, you know. So I started wondering, can I build better blankets? Or blankets that for me, I could like more? And specifically, the question we considered in this paper is, let's say you have data you have the two processes. You have all the statistics, so you can make a great joint distribution in a very lucky situation. And then could you reverse engineer from the data which are the actions, which are the sensory, so kind of reconstruct a perception action loop from data. Instead of taking it for granted and start working from there, could you reverse engineer and find the most likely perception action loop that could have give rise to the behavior that you are measuring? So that was the question, the starting point. Now, my idea was, well, we know a bit about sufficient statistics, and let's try to use these ideas from computational mechanics and epsilon machines to build such sufficient statistics in time series. That was and so can I make a perception action loop based on this type of equivalent relationships and stuff like that? So that was the intention. Then we start thinking about, okay, what are sufficient statistics? This is a bit of a small digression, but maybe it would be interesting for you. So there is a funny relationship between the classical view of sufficient statistics that has to do, in classical world, parameters and variables are very different. You should not confuse them, they are very different. So in classical, you say a variable y is a sufficient statistics of f with respect to a parameter theta if when you condition x on y, suddenly theta doesn't make a difference. So this is the classical definition of sufficient statistics. Now there is a strong, we can call it strong Bayesian version, that you say, I will think of theta as a variable, and I will require that x and theta become conditionally independent based on y for any prior over theta. So this is a pretty strong condition. And you can prove that the Bayesian strong version implies the classical. There are some really weird, obscure examples where the converse doesn't hold. If you are interested, I can show you some Russian papers with counterexamples in this. And then there is a weak version of the Bayesian where you say for a given prior, the conditional independency holds. And I'm going to work with the weak version because for my purposes is good enough. So if we're following the weak version of the Bayesian sufficient statistics, two variables, you can say, for given two variables, you can say that a third variable, y, that is a function of x, is a sufficient statistics of f with respect to set if this condition holds. And so this is reminiscent of on the definition, but for my information theoretic brain, the thing that speaks the most is that there is something called the data processing inequality that says whatever x and set share in common, if you coarse grain x, you can only lose information. So in general, any coarse graining is going to reduce the mutual information. But if you find a coarse graining where the thing stays the same, that's a sufficient statistic. And the idea with sufficient statistics is usually you try to compress your variable while keeping everything that is relevant. And then you can ask questions like, is there an optimal compression, a minimal coarse graining that still keeps all the information? And lo and behold, there is a relatively easy way to do this. The variables are discrete. That is exactly the equivalent relationship related with epsilon machines. Is whenever whatever two x's give the same conditional distributions over set, you identify them, and you don't identify anything that doesn't follow this. So you identify that and only that. Then that gives you the optimal coarse graining. All right. So this is sort of the foundation over which we're going to build. Now, an interesting question is, can you do a sufficient statistics for time series? And I was looking for that in the literature and I couldn't find any that could work for me. So we invented one that we call dynamical Bayesian sufficient statistics. And the idea here is that, let's say you have a time series y and you have a time series x, and you want to predict y based on x. And predict means you have the information up to time t, and you want to predict the next time point of y. So now, a sufficient statistics in this sense would be another time series that we can call u, that will be a function of x, but a function respecting the time precedence. So the function can take any realization of x up to time t, and you can also consider previous ones, but no, you cannot include the future. And if you can build a function of x such that, so the precedence condition is that you don't include the future, and sufficiency means that this conditional independency thing holds. But now it becomes a bit tricky because you don't want to only condition on the sufficient statistic, you also want to condition on the history of y. And the intuition here is that, let's say you, from y itself, you can predict a bit to its own future. Then you want to see what is the extra that I can predict of y because knowing x. And now that is the extra is what I want to compress. And that extra is what is compressing to you. Yes?
So you don't allow u of t to be dependent on the previous x's,
Yes.
only of x of t.
No, you allow previous, but you don't allow future x.
But I mean, maybe the way it's written is like
Ah,
f of x of t, so f of x
it's
of t
annotation.
minus x
The
minus
bold x means everything up to t. Yeah, that's fine. Sorry,
So is this different from the sufficient statistics theorem for epsilon transducers?
I didn't know about that. It's a particular case. So I think the transducer are more general because the transducer you can also include the future. But in this case, you restrict that you don't care about the future. But yes, it ends up being a particular case.
And how is it particular? What's the specificity that you're talking
You
about?
don't include the future.
That you don't include the future of x into u. You only consider x until time t.
You don't in an epsilon transducer either.
No?
You assume it's conditionally independent.
Yeah, they're
Tell me the difference is it doesn't look as though your x directly influences y. Like, I mean, there's like the transducer, you're potentially assuming some element of choice in the inputs, whereas here you're saying you've got some given process.
Okay, I thought you could include the future of x in order to transduce into a present of y.
It's just a different case, right?
Hmm.
That's why. I mean, in fact, it sort of comes up. If you move out of just a pure temporal setting for transducers, I think times process x and mapping it to y, and you set this up and you condition off test. But then when you move into a domain like space and time, it gets more subtle. You have these other kinds of dependencies and kind of causalities you have to consider. And so in general cases,
So I think at the end we end up rediscovering transducers without knowing they exist. But this is where we're coming to.
Yeah, it's called causal conditioning, right? I mean, and don't forget that if you have a Bayesian network, that is essentially generalization of time, right? If you have causal Bayesian network, you have multiple timelines essentially. Every forward path, every direct path is a timeline. So I guess it's possible to generalize it.
but the general Bayes net framework doesn't allow cycles, you know, the whole
Exactly.
Peroni stuff. Whereas if you use causal states, it's fine. You get cycles just fine. It's not. Time is an important thing. It was all grew up in dynamical systems. Time is key there. It's just not. You don't stub your toe.
So from this definition we can find some results. The first is that the same way that for epsilon machines, the epsilon machine captures all the predicted information from past to future, here this dynamical based on sufficient statistic is capturing the transfer entropy. So whatever was the transfer entropy, that is the extra information that x gives you to predict y over what the past to y gives you, that is captured by replacing x by u, that is the thing that gives the relevant information. Right? So it's sort of the same thing but applying this concept of time series. And then the result is that this dynamical based on sufficient statistic exists always and is unique. And I'm quoting here the epsilon transducer because it's a particular case of the epsilon transducer. But
the transfer entropy is not enough because transfer entropy confuses conditional independence with conditional dependence. And in your statistic, transfer entropy does that. There's a whole range of structures you can't represent. Right? I can have some variables, condition on the variable. Oh, they're all independent. Great. I found some interesting blanket conditioning. But it's also the case that I give you another variable and these things become conditioned. And transfer entropy is too simple, based on too simple a notion of mutual information. We then do the, you know this. So yeah.
So yeah, I will come to that place.
Oh, okay, good.
So with this we are finding that this dynamical based on sufficient statistics always exist. In the beginning I expected naively, now it feels a bit obvious that it does, but in the beginning I thought maybe it exists in some cases, in some other cases it doesn't exist, but it happens that it does. And based on that idea, now coming back to our original motivation. Let's say we have this data, we have this bivariate statistics, and we want to build these actions and perceptions. So basically the idea is the following. First, we take the environment as X, and we take the agent as Y, and we're going to find this minimal Bayesian dynamic sufficient statistic. And what is the meaning of that? So in all this work, the math is relatively simple, but I think the interesting thing is how to interpret it. So here we are coarse-graining past trajectories of the environment, and we keep only the distinctions that make a difference for the future of the agent. Right? And the intuition is that one could interpret this as what the agent can perceive. Because whatever you cannot perceive, you cannot act upon that thing. So if you cannot see something, you would not make a difference on yourself because you can't see it. But if you can see it, that might generate some change in your future behavior. Right? So the idea is that this coarse graining in the histories of the environment will capture, maybe it's an upper bound, maybe you are not going to react on everything, or, I mean a lower bound, but it captures effectively what is shaping the future of the agent. And in that sense you could interpret it as the sensory that is available for that agent. Now, then we do the same game, and that is a coarse graining of the past trajectories of the environment. Then we play the same game vice versa. So now we call Y the environment and X the agent, and we are coarse graining the past trajectories of the agent that make no difference for the future of the environment, and we separate different trajectories of the agent that make a difference for the future of the environment. So with the same reasoning, we could conceive these distinctions as actions, because whenever there is a change in what the agent was doing, then there is going to be a downstream effect to what the environment states are going to be. Does it make sense? So it's sort of an interpretation of this. And this gives a coarse graining of the trajectories of the agent. And in that way, we come with a heuristic to build from X and Y, we build A, a time series of actions, that is coarse graining of X, and a coarse graining of the environment that would be the time series of the perceptions, of the sensory data. So, and then the construction would look like this. So you have your original time series, and then you have these two variables that are mediating how the agent and the environment are interacting. One is the mediation from the agent to the environment, that would be the actions, and this is a coarse graining of the agent. And the other variable would be a coarse graining of the environment that is mediating how the environment affects the agent. And these are the causal brackets, these two epsilon transducers. Now, there are some interesting properties. The first is that they always exist, and this was a little bit disappointing because I was expecting, oh, maybe these blankets can only be built in specific cases. Now, and we're going to get to your point, Jim, because in some cases they don't make so much sense. So constructively you can always build them, but then what will come later is to what degree we can take them seriously. But they always exist. The second is that they are unique up to some relabeling, which is nice. And the third is that they mediate the transfer entropy that could be interpreted as what goes through these brackets.
I feel like I've missed something. When you say that they always exist and are unique, is that for a given split between agent and environment?
Yes. That's another super important point. So let's say we have one thing, and we split it into X and Y. That split is pretty arbitrary.
Yeah.
And for that split, we're calculating these things, and for any split, we can find the.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, that makes sense.
And then it would be nice to.
It's like given a Cartesian frame, given like a separation.
Exactly. So it would be nice to have a criterion to say, well, actually, for that split, you can build a blanket, but they make no sense.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe for this other split, they will make much more sense. So, and I will present now an idea to do that judgment, which I am pretty sure is incomplete, but it's a first effort to characterize how serious you should take the blankets. So to give a simple example, let's say we have X and Y that are independent of each other. They are doing whatever they want, but they are not affecting each other. In that case, the actions on the sensory are both constant. They're nothing. So that exists, but now one interesting quantity is this degree of synergy between x and y. And one way of measuring this that we're going to use here is the following. We are going to take the conditional probability of the next x, given the past of x and the past of y, the conditional probability of y, conditional on the past of x and the past of y, and we're going to have the joint probability of these two things conditional on the joint past. And we're going to take the ratio and we're going to take the logarithm. So if the joint probability is equal to the product, then this thing is 0. But in general, it might be different, and that would give you a sense of to what degree there is something funky going on.
So to remind me, x and y are the time series of the agent and the environment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Basically, it's a localized version of information, mutual information, conditional on the past.
Yeah, temporarily localized.
So from this definition, one thing that so now we start from a different place. We want to measure how much synergistic information is going on beyond the causal blankets. And the intuition is that the blankets are mediating some interaction, but not some others. There are some other interactions that are not being accounted by the blankets. And to measure that, we are going to do the following. We're going to define something that we say the integrated information of the system, a little bit inspired by autonomy. And the definition is going to be, we're going to take the Kullback-Leibler divergence of the joint process up to t plus 1, and we're going to compare it against the two marginal processes. So the distribution of one marginalizing the other, and the distribution of the second marginalizing the first. And we're going to see to what degree these two things are different in Kullback-Leibler terms. So if you do the math, you will find this interesting decomposition that says the degree to which these two things are interacting is the sum of the transfer entropies plus the synergistic part. And from here, the intuition is that if the synergistic part, that is what is not accounted by the blankets are completely oblivious to the first coefficient. So they don't see it. So if the synergy is much larger than the transfer entropy, that means that your blankets are a pretty poor description of the interaction. Because they are describing the first part but not the second part, and the second part is dominating over the first part. So you should not take them seriously. Now, if the synergistic term is 0, that will say that all the difference between, or all the strength of this distinction between having this system separately or together is completely accounted by the transfer entropy. And that could be a reason to take these blankets more seriously. And that's a first sort of very simple heuristic. Yes?
But I mean, that would mean that only has two systems that are not interacting at all. You should take the blanket very seriously, which might be good.
No, they could be interacting, but the interaction completely accounted by the transfer entropies.
Right, but then I'm saying there's also the case where they're not interacting at all.
Yeah, in that case there would be 0 and 0.
Okay.
And then maybe you should also do blankets in that case. So the blankets, what they are accounting is what is taken into account by this first term that is sort of what is accounted by these boundaries, and to the degree that that thing is active, then the blankets are doing something. If not, there's nothing.
Is this all possible boundaries? I mean, I'm a little bit concerned with relying on the transfer entry. Like I said before, it confuses two different kinds of conditional and unconditional dependence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's another framework. You have process X, process Y, consider the joint alphabet, construct the epsilon chain, you have the global epsilon chain, and then what you can do is an algebraic question. Look at all the factorings of the joint epsilon chain into conditional matrix. And then there's a property over those that indicates how the X and Y separate. And that naturally doesn't trip you up in terms of missing certain kinds of cleaving between the two. So, so starting from global epsilon machine, you get this joint machine, call it, and now you're asking for conditional machines. And that gives you and that's algebraic at that point, and you can just kind of factor these things out and interpret what the kind of efficacies of the different conditional matrix.
It's combinatorially expensive though, right? Sure. I'm just
Absolutely. Yes. That doesn't
It's
stop.
not a crime. It's not a crime.
No.
I just wanted to understand that.
Yeah. Well, I move with the attitudes. Okay, that's really computationally intensive. Screw it. Let's just try it.
Yeah.
In cases and hopefully at some point you go in a more efficient way. So, yeah. Yes.
And to what degree you can do that algebra of having the joint epsilon machine, having the two local ones and compare them?
Chromoids. is the inspiration.
Yeah.
Bergman's been talking about that, so that there are
Mm.
tools that suggest how.
Yeah. Well, that's the direction I want to go,
Yeah, okay,
and that's I feel it
Yeah.
would be the proper way of doing it.
Okay, good, great.
In directed information, you don't have this synergistic part. If you look at directed information, that's usually you get two components, one in one direction, one in the other direction. I wonder what that tells us.
But
In fact,
is the directed information?
directed information is when you build essentially the flow of information from one channel to the other channel, causally conditioned. So you can condition, but only on the past, on the causal past, and it has slightly different properties. It's a bit more honest about information transfer than transfer entropy.
Because of the causal.
Yes. So what you get is it assumes that the receiver has infinite memory, but it never double counts information. So information is transmitted once, but never again. So it's usually less than transfer entropy. And it's not causal in the sense that it doesn't actually measure when, if you forget everything on the receiver side, it will not count it again. It will pretend like it was remembered. So it's a little bit different. I kind of like it, but again, it's not purely causal. But does not have any synergistic term. It basically, if you have a direct information, it consists of the part that goes one direction, part that goes in the other direction, shifted by one, something like that.
Well, so one way that I think this distinction between transfer entropies and this synergy part is that you can think there are four variables at play.
Okay.
The past of x, the past of y, the future of x, the future of y.
Mm-hmm.
And the synergies consider three of them. Sorry, the transfer entropy considers three of them. Either one side of three, the other side of three. But they never count four. And then you can recover the four variable p distribution from the three y's, then there's no synergy and then everything is fine. But if you have something that is four level, then you are in trouble.
I see. Okay.
So yeah, so this is at this point this was the best heuristic we could come with, and by that the idea would be this construction of blankets makes sense only if the synergy part is you can neglect it, and if the synergy part dominates, then you shouldn't take very seriously. Maybe it's not a good idea to use. So another exercise I can do is to try different partitions, measure the synergy for each of them, and minimize the synergy. And maybe that could be a useful way to split it. But I agree, this is very heuristic, and I think the proper way is some kernel road version of it. So, what do we have so far? So, this is something that tries to be a principal way to build an as-if perception action loop from data. So we have two time series, and we build these action and sensory variables, and we have a way to understand this data as being part of a perception action loop. The good news is that we can always do this construction, and the bad news is that the blankets are limited because there is some collective effects that are not accounted by the blankets, and that could be a reason to decide when to apply the blankets or not. Now, what are the things that I would like to do with this? So, as a personal note, what happened to me, I was working on this, and then when I tried to go for the next step, I started stumbling upon these questions of the join epsilon machine, the smaller part, and then I went into a rabbit hole that ended up being this other work on multi-scale epsilon machines. And now I'm hoping to come back to this. So, what is the type of things that I would like to be able to do at the end of a journey in this direction? The first is, can we formalize goals with a similar idea? I have no idea if it's possible, but it would be interesting to think if something about a co-unifilar, like a machine going backwards or something like that could give some traction on a system driven by goals versus a system being pushed from behind by physics. This is an open question, I have no idea how to do it, but I feel it's a very interesting.
But you should be optimistic, because at least we know how to deal with forward and reverse epsilon machines and calculating the blow up of causal states when we change the direction of time, and all that stuff is the tools there for dealing with it.
Yeah.
And you really do have to take into account. You might have an idea in your system which direction time is.
Yeah.
It may not share that with you, and therefore you need tools that don't throw away reverse causality. Then you're throwing away possibly discovering interesting mechanisms. So but the nice thing is with the epsilon machines transistor, you can do forward and backwards. We know how to invert these things that describe the reverse process or the forward process and so on. So
Yeah.
the reasons of interest. Go forward.
Another question is coming back a bit to the original Princeton intention of this. Is it possible to build to get some type of inference from these blankets? And this was the sort of like reflex answer that Carl gave me when he saw this work. He told me, yeah, your blankets are cute, but can you recover inference? And I don't know.
But what?
Can you recover some type of inference process happening because these blankets are at place? And it's an interesting question, even to try to formalize, to
The
frame
answer
it.
should be no, because like you have a formalism here that you can just apply to any system, and
Yeah.
even if your like synergistic measure is low, that's not nearly enough assumption to like give you a physical system that actually intuitively looks like an agent, right?
Fair enough.
So you should not be able to recover inference with just these assumptions. You should need more.
One thing that I have thought that I think is a bit trivial, but maybe it's an interesting first, very tiny step, is that I think you can frame an MDP that an agent like this is optimally solved. It might be a super stupid, silly MDP, but I think that might be possible.
Yeah, so there's a whole thing. Yeah, I was writing a bit about this earlier this year. For MDPs in particular, there is like the question of whether a given policy is optimal for any utility function in the long run is not trivial for MDPs. So
Can you say that again? What's the statement?
So if you have a policy for an MDP and you ask, does there exist any utility function over state at the final time, non-trivial utility functions, not uniform, over the state at the final time, such that this policy is optimal for that utility function, that's non-trivial. There are policies and environments for which the answer is no. So there's like a non-trivial sense in which a policy can be like viewed as agentic in that
Okay.
sense.
Is there a characterization for which are not? The answer is no?
Yeah, actually, mixed preferences.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
But so anything in that direction I would be very interested to pursue, even if the answer is no. Then another question is it possible to build multi-level custom blankets and then to use these to study hierarchical agency? Hierarchical agency is something I find really interesting, like could you have these agents that at the same time they are part of a bigger agent and there are plans at different scales and all this, and very quickly the intuition goes a bit crazy, but if we have a nice formalism it could be useful to start reasoning about this. So is it possible to do
Nice
this?
example of that is just cellular automata that form patterns. They naturally build these hierarchical levels. You can have the zeros and ones on the space-time lattice, and then those actually form these little clumps that we all identify with glider guns and stuff like that. And then those can actually form into other higher level, next level computations, and so on. Or if you stop at some level, you get a finite description. So
But do you think that different scales of that could be framed as solving an MDP or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, what you'd expect to see at different scales is you're going to have sort of different scales at which the interactions are low dimensional relative to the internals.
Cool. So this is another direction. And finally, can we construct these things to identify agents in the wild? Can we measure these things numerically from data and use it for interesting purposes? And I was a bit pessimistic about this, but I feel that the work that Alan, Shai, and others are doing with transformers, transformers have this encoder-decoder architecture that I think it could be, one should recover stuff like this from this. When transformers are used for translation, for example. So I'm optimistic that maybe there are ways to use this new.
What would be a Causal blanket in the context of doing interpretability like Adam is doing?
So what I was doing is you have a single time series and you record
Yeah, I know, but
information.
what would be a Causal blanket?
So in this case you would have two time series and you are put a case of translation. So you have a text in one language, you want to translate it to another language, and then the transformer is sort of fitting both to predict the next token. And that feels similar to this. I'm not sure if it works, but I feel maybe there's a way to match these things.
But what does it mean identify agents in the wild when you already know your X and Y?
Well, let me advocate again for, again, I like simple, concrete framings. Just look at one-dimensional cellular automata. The nice thing about that is that over some period of time, in the generic case, these things appear. Particles. They're agents. They actually have internal nice because you don't know ahead of time when you write out the local dynamic what particles are going to emerge. So you don't get to bias anything with any subjective stuff, so those spontaneously emerge. And they have memory. Basically, particles in deterministic cellular time are little clocks. And then they can interact. So you have these particle-particle interactions. You can talk about that as some population of agents interacting. So it'd be interesting, I think, maybe to try some of this transformer interpretive framework back in that setting where we kind of understand how the space-time dynamics decomposes into invariant sets of backgrounds and various kinds of particles and the chemistry through which they interact. And that's all actually exact.
How complicated is this one-dimensional automata need to be? Do you need like Wolfram's stuff or something more complicated?
I really, speaking that kind of simply, but it's just a test case, and it's all deterministic, and they form these non-trivial patterns. They're deterministic in terms of a local space-time rule, but in fact, at the next level, rule 18 is actually, the next level is actually a stochastic particle machine. So there's cases where you have random motion, even though the underlying microdynamics are deterministic. That's kind of fun. These chemistries emerge. So for like rule 110, the universal 1DCA, there's probably 15 or 20 of these elementary particles in different kinds of invariant sets, but it's been pretty well analyzed. You can sort of see how you build things up. The problem there, of course, is that you can take those emergent structures and build a universal Turing machine. Therefore, Morse questions are undecidable. But it's really simple. You can see the patterns, you can study them, and we know how to describe them in terms of the dynamical systems geometry of the state space in terms of invariant sets and Bayesian boundaries and so I'm just advocating like a really simple setting in which we can simulate the hell out of these 1DCAs. That's not hard at all, and it's nice emerging problems, and these entities have agent-like characteristics. Okay, so probably not everything we mean, but at least it pushes you to think.
Yeah, I think like my biggest point to the whole talk and also this was like keep using the word agent for these things. Like these are just generic abstractions. Like you're just generically talking about how to get a high level from a low level, and like there's nothing specifically agentic about it.
Right.
Like it's a great framework for talking about abstraction. And agents, like if you want to model agents, that is going to be an abstraction. There better be an abstraction step in there, but like the part where you go from abstraction to agent is a different part that like needs some extra pieces.
But you do the WinDCA case, so you know you can get rid of the word agent there.
Yeah.
And we can work on the kind of agent you mean, so we don't confuse these things.
Right. Yeah.
So do you have a clear list of what are the things that are missing from abstraction to agency?
So, I mean, I have the like standard things that I think of as being in between those. I don't necessarily think they're canonically correct or whatever, but like my standard steps would be you do something of this flavor as your first abstraction step to separate into like a thing that you're going to call the agent in the environment, and then the thing that makes it agentic is this part of the world is acting differently as a function of its inputs in such a way that the environment gets steered into a like narrower set of states than it could be if the subsystem was just like taking constant actions or taking actions independent of the environment or something like that.
So like, is it just the goal-like thing? If you have the goal-like thing, you have an agent?
Yeah, so the definition I just gave is basically just it's like doing some goal-like thing to the environment.
I think there is an interesting thing here of like, I think you're right that it requires a bunch more steps, but I do think that this kind of thing can be extended to goal-like things. Where you
So like this is the right sort of foundation. Like you need something like this in order to like do that next step.
So let me try this, getting back to this really simple set of entities. So you can build using rule 110 a universal Turing machine. So you can actually program in, based on where you put the particles and domains and stuff, a particular calculation.
Yep.
That is your goal. But then you can go back in and do this, how much is the alpha particle and the beta particle, are they actually contributing to getting there?
Right.
That might help kind of parse out some of these questions we were talking about. Yeah.
That sounds right.
I think the setting that's like one step more exciting than that, but harder, is can you find a setting in which goals spontaneously emerge? So you're describing a setting in which
Absolutely, yes.
the goal
Let's try to use it as possible. We're getting our hierarchy of confusion.
I think the concept of goal is a little bit of a red herring because I think it's a very human category to make, and I think it's more instrumental that you want to survive. You want to
one of the things we did, because we were interested in that, because metal-dimensional might really work, we actually have a population of cellular automata that were evolving.
Okay.
So you could actually talk about individual space-time things. What kind of particles did they evolve individually as they interacted with each other, as they tried to survive? So you have a notion of fitness. So it was actually in the genetic algorithm setting.
Right.
The genetic algorithm on its own terms was trying to find these local space-time rules for the cellular automata, such that they did some kind of global computation.
Right.
Yeah. So again, toy framework, I think that's all really straightforward, but it needs some kind of questioning from these kinds of questions. And this is, hopefully it'll help ground some of these ideas because they're kind of straightforward. Yeah.
You're saying that the concept of the goal may be too anthropomorphic, but could you say the same thing about the concept of agent?
No, I think the problem of goal. I have a reason why I'm skeptical about goals, because it can be very vague, it can be very wide, it can be very general, and sometimes
Yeah.
it's not narrowing the space but actually widening the space. For example, when you're in an antagonistic scenario, you want to create uncertainty in the environment. So I think far more fundamental than goals is persistence, however it looks like. And what seems to be the case is that there are certain trajectory bottlenecks in the space of what can happen that then we cluster and say, oh, this is a goal. But the reality is that the goal is an emergent phenomenon to something more fundamental that.
One reason why I want to push back on that is I think there's the two different settings in which we might expect goals to arise as an emergent phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah, so lunch is in like 2.5 minutes, so I think I'm gonna